Just setting the recording.
No, man.
All right.
Come on, it's only 10 years old.
All right, so start. We're a little bit late, so I'll start. I want to make sure we end on time for everyone. So, thank you again to Jody to kick it off. And I'm sorry my computer's here again. The recording request. So, anyway, so we started. I know we've had a few week break, and I know some of you have been to some of the last few classes. But we basically started. This is the third week that we're going to be doing a series in great Jewish philosophers, or sort of impactful Jewish philosophers. We said they were all going to be modern. We started with Maimonides, who was not modern from the 12th century, but we started with him because we sort of said every Jewish writer or Jewish thinker thinks and writes in the shadow of Maimonides, whether that's agreeing with him or disagreeing with him. So we started with Maimonides last week, or I guess it was 3 weeks ago, but last time we talked about Eliezer Berkovits for a very, very sort of brief, sort of 2 or 3 sentence summary. Eliezer Berkovitz's vision was the whole structure of Judaism is designed to create a model society in order to have that model society have an impact on the world to create more and more model societies. Idea being, if we're going to be a model for bringing goodness to the world, can't happen on an individual level because most of the issues that are faced in the world, or many of them at least, are faced on societal levels. And so you have to build a society in order to be able to engage in the world of building economies, justice systems, engaging in war when you have to, etc. This week we're going to talk about Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. So, brief biography. Joseph Soloveitchik's born early 20th century I believe in Belarus, but I forget now, in Eastern Europe. He is born into a sort of dynastic rabbinic Lithuanian family, meaning a family who was known for its Jewish scholarship. Sort of, every father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-grandfather, uncles, great-uncles, everyone is sort of very impactful, influential, and renowned rabbis in the Lithuanian sort of yeshiva world. So renowned primarily in the world of Jewish scholarship and Jewish law and Talmud study. He goes to He starts there. He goes to University of Berlin, which was called like the Harvard of Europe at the time, and studies philosophy and gets his PhD in philosophy at the University of Berlin. In the early 30s, he studies and writes about a man named Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen was a sort of liberal, back then liberal meant, wouldn't use current word of liberal, but liberal Jewish philosopher in terms of not part of the Orthodox Jewish world, but he's very much a Jewish philosopher, but also impactful in the secular philosophical world as a student of Immanuel Kant. We'll talk about Immanuel Kant a little bit, but Immanuel Kant, we talked about him a bit, I think, in the last class. Immanuel Kant was a philosopher from the 19th century, early 19th century, who really brought in the dawn of modern, now we're talking about philosophy generally, not Jewish. He was sort of one of the fathers of modern philosophy. Most importantly, after Kant, basically, people stopped thinking that you could prove anything about metaphysical questions like, is there free will? Does God exist? Is there a soul? Like questions like that after Kant, philosophers basically stopped trying to answer them. Before that, philosophers were all trying to disprove things. He ended that. And for religious philosophy, people who were religious philosophers but still versed in the secular world, that changed a lot about how they wrote, as opposed to, if you look at treatises, a lot of like religious treatises from the Middle Ages, they're all trying to prove things. How do we prove certain things about Christian dogma, about Jewish dogma, about revelation, about a God, about creation? That all stopped after Kant, and philosophy had to take a new turn. So we said, we can't prove anything anymore. What do we do? There are lots of things lots of different movements that emerged after that. One of the most influential movements is called existentialism. Existentialism, basically, and you'll have lots of people try to define this different ways, but as opposed to saying we're going to look at concepts and try to prove what's real in the world, the starting point for existentialist thought was human experience. And you built out from how your experience in the world, from your experience of things, to create a map of what the world is and what life is about, as opposed to saying we're going to deduct with like principles of logic and prove all sorts of things. Anyways, that was a long tangent. Coming back to Rav Soloveitchik. So Rav Soloveitchik, born to this dynastic rabbinic family of Jewish scholarship, goes to University of Berlin, studies, does his PhD, writing about one of the most important students of Immanuel Kant, who was a Jewish philosopher. leaves Europe before the war, comes to New York with his father, who's a big rabbi, is brought to New York to teach. I don't remember if he was the dean or one of the senior people at Yeshiva University, which was sort of called the modern Orthodox flagship institution in America that was supposed to sort of train a new cadre of rabbis who were going to be both, trained both in Jewish education and in Talmudic education and also in secular studies. His father becomes the dean there, and Rabbi Soloveitchik ends up taking that over. He also is a community rabbi in different places, including in Boston. He has a massive impact on the North American Jewish community in a very practical way, both as being at the head of the most important institution and as a sort of communal rabbi who built a lot of sort of communal institutions. The other way in which he had a massive impact is he basically trained, I can make up a number, but let's say he trained like 70 to 80% of the English-speaking modern Orthodox rabbis that sort of lived after him, because most of them came through YU. There wasn't another sort of mainstream institution of modern Orthodoxy, and he was such a massive presence that he sort of trained a generation. And in that way, even though, so we talked about Eliezer Berkovitz last week, and I sort of said, I thought sort of he should get a lot more press, so to speak, than Rabbi Soloveitchik is the one everyone kind of talks about as like the founder of American modern Orthodox Judaism. I think in many ways, to me personally, Rabbi Berkovitz's philosophy has a lot to add that Rabbi Soloveitchik doesn't cover about communal building communities and states and societies and the goal of Judaism on a global scale. Rabbi Soloveitchik's, Rabbi Berkovitz was in Chicago at a smaller institution, training less people, and Rabbi Soloveitchik was in New York. And he trained, and so he trained, and I'm not saying that because, which one was great. I'm saying in practice, he was in the central institution. He trained all of these sort of the next generation of leaders. And so in the modern Orthodox world, from the far liberal end to the much more right-wing end, a lot of these sort of English-speaking leaders of the next generation all saw themselves as his student. So his impact is probably much bigger than his thought, his impact on sort of the people who then went out and became the leaders across North American Jewry, or North American Orthodox Jewry at least. So that's sort of a bit of a background of who he is. What we're going to talk about today, though, is really focused on his thought, sort of not dealing with him as a person at all. He wrote a decent amount. A lot of the stuff was published after, and there's a ton of essays and a lot of works that go into different topics, and so we're not going to cover everything. I sort of picked a way to try to centralize, here's his vision of what Judaism is. There's a lot of other stuff of his worth reading outside of what's covered here. Okay, with that in mind, we'll sort of start at the first source. And the first source talks about it's his understanding of sort of pre-Judaism, or pre-religion, let's say, how man relates to God naturally. Before, I'm going to say man, I mean humans. Yeah. So, anyways, yeah, I know it's not,
Yeah, we got it.
I was going to say it's not PC, that was a terrible pun. Anyways, okay. All right, so look at the first source. This is from a work called Uvikashta Misham, translated as From There You Shall Seek, it's a quote from Deuteronomy. That's where the title comes from. He says, there are 4 realms in which man seeks the image of the Creator as reflected in creation, which include being, nature, and spirit. Okay, there's 4 realms, he says, in which man basically seeks God in creation, meaning if we're separating from creation and revelation in his language, revelation is God revealing himself, let's say, in the Torah, in our tradition. Separate from that is creation, is the stuff you encounter regardless of whether you're Jewish, not Jewish, just encountering the world. So there's 4 realms in creation where man seeks God, independently of religion itself. The cosmic drama, so what's going on in, call it nature, the universe. The depths of his spiritual existence, so the internal spiritual existence of an individual. The system of a priori concepts, conceptual thought. And a particular religious facticity and transcendental experience. I'm not sure exactly how you distinguish between 4 and 2. 2 and 4 are different versions of, let's call them, the internal spiritual experience. So you have man seeks God naturally, let's say, I'll call it 3 ways because I can't distinguish between 2 and 4, in seeing the cosmos and the scientific drama and the universe unfold, in thought and the power of rational thought, the power of our ability to conceptualize things. A priori concepts, this is something taken largely from Kant and his influence, but a priori concepts mean concepts that are pre-experienced. So without even looking at sense data, pure logic, it's just our ability to think. And then the spiritual experience, our own spiritual experience. In these areas, Religious reason explores the following elements respectively. Here's how we seek out God in those 4 areas. A, the lawfulness of the effect, the first cause, the telos, and the continuity of the causal order, as well as the rupture within it. So the way, the cause and effect in nature, the laws of science. B, the complex of moral will, which is manifested paradoxically in the joint consciousness of freedom and obligation. Basically, okay, so here, our ability to have moral intuition, a sense of morality, a sense of being both free to do whatever we want, but bound, that to him is a part that happens inside humans, he would argue naturally. That's part of this religious experience. Skip down to C, the pinnacle, the system of pure concepts of the understanding. Let's skip that for a second. D, the sense of absolute dependence, the frustrated yearnings pulsating in man's spirit, ecstasy of the mystical masters. Call this spiritual experience, right? Our sense of dependence, of contingency, of how small we are, our sense of, our sense of transcendence, all those types of spiritual, mystical experiences. That's the 4th version. I don't care about all of his order here. We can sort of put that to the side. The idea here he's saying is man seeks God pre-religion. We seek God and we find and we sort of discover God in looking at the universe and our sense of, and whether that's, he has a very rational bent. He's an existentialist thinker, meaning he's deeply involved in like the struggle of the spirit, but he's also a very rational thinker in how he analyzes things. So he'll talk about cause and effect of science and moral law. For someone else, it might be less purely rational and more emotional in terms of how that, that spiritual, you might find God not in the laws of science, but in just the wonder of the universe and the wonder of science. You might, so that's, I don't care so much about the way he lays it out. The idea here is you start with man as a natural search for God, and he's searching for God and discovers God both outside of himself in nature, inside of himself in his own internal struggles, in all sorts of ways. There's actually, and if you go to the second source, he expressed this in a maybe more beautiful and maybe more accessible way. He says both cosmos conscious man and origin conscious man quest for God. Ignore his titles, although they're not always aware of this. Man yearns for God in his feverish haste to get farther and farther from home, and in his lonesomeness for home, and experiencing the spell that home casts upon him. The wanderlust that people experience, the need to constantly go farther to never be settled, and the joy and the seeking of just a small place to call home in your own place, all of those are a search for God. It's a search for a presence in the way he's understanding it. Right? Cosmic man finds God, if ready for him, in the vastness and boundlessness of the cosmic drama and the heavenly galaxies billions of light years away. Homebound, origin-minded man finds God in the limitedness and narrowness of finitude, the smallness and the modest home into which man was born and to which he willy-nilly returns. Right? You can find God anywhere, so to speak, but he's saying man seeks God out. He seeks God in all of your wandering, searchings, however that manifests itself in your life. That can be in physical wanderings and sort of, not finding a place. It can be in intellectual wanderings, emotional, spiritual, whatever those are. That's a search for God. Now, it's important to frame. You may not see that, or you or anyone may not experience that as a search for God. He's making a fundamental claim about what humans do. Humans may walk around not knowing they're searching for God. That is what they are doing in his understanding. Right? So this is the human condition. All of your searchings and emotional and our rational develop, like everything that's going on in all our quests is a search for something beyond. Yeah.
Can you break that down for someone who maybe doesn't practice organized religion? How does that kind of open doors for them if you see it that way?
I don't know if it opens doors or so. The starting point is, so for someone, I'll divide that into, let's say someone who has no interest in religion or a God or spirituality at all, and then someone who might be spiritually interested or engaged but not by sort of a organized religion. What Rav Soloveitchik is arguing is not like he's not trying to convince you to do something or not, or take you somewhere. He's making a claim about this is what humans are. Humans are looking for God. They may deny God, they may hate God, they may hate religion and think religion is the worst thing that ever happened to the world, and they may be ardent rationalists or anti-rationalist artists who both hate God and they still are searching for God, they just don't know it. They may be he hasn't yet made any argument for organized religion, right? He said you're searching for God, but we haven't gotten to organized religion yet. So if we go to the next this next source, see, yeah.
You're searching for God. What's God?
I have no idea, and I don't think he would have. I think he would say he doesn't have an idea what God is, other than a lawgiver, which we'll get to.
So we're just searching for something.
We are searching.
It's a search for the cause of all these
subcategories of the world and life, and he's saying God is the cause. But I think to your question, it's really what's the cause, and then he's labeled it. Well, God is the cause.
So in the scientific part, that's definitely the search for the cause or the source. I agree. I think, but I don't know when he says like man searching for God. Does he mean? I don't know. I think he means more than man searching for like the answer of like what came first. He's saying when you're looking for, because you can be a scientist, you can be an astronomer, a secular astronomer. You're trying to find out the origins of the Big Bang. You're not looking. If you ask that person, what are you looking for? They're not going to say I'm looking for God. But I am looking for the source. But I think you would say it's almost. I think, and I may be wrong, right? But I think he's saying there's looking for something more than just the answer. The answer isn't going to there's like a hole. I don't know, there's a hole that God fills. That's a very like cheesy way to say it, right? But there is an unsatisfiable thirst. I don't know. Like to me, I relate to this in a certain way through wanderlust. But like, I think people may relate to this through different ways. But there's searches or quests that you have for certain things, I think, that are just unsatisfiable. Meaning, let's say you love books, you love fiction, you pick up one book and you just want to get to the next, and you love this. Like, there's a thirst there that's just not really quenchable. You can love powder, right? And you'll fly across the world when there's a snowstorm. Like, humans are looking for something, and the things we're looking for aren't satisfying what we're looking for. Arguably, maybe some people look for something, they find it, and then they're just like happy. I don't know. I wish I don't feel that way. I feel like you're always looking, but I think he's saying that's part of the condition. That's part of the condition. We're always There's a God behind that we're sort of always really looking for. That all of our quests can never be satisfied on their own. Does that make sense? I'm kind of talking around it because I don't have words to.
Meaning?
I think God would fulfill the need for would fulfill that need for meaning. Yeah, I think the search for meaning might be another way of framing it.
What
But
you said tracks with the evolution of religion from polytheism to monotheism. You're just looking for answers and causes for rain and the sun.
So that would be an explanation for.
And
Right.
There's a God for everything.
So that would be an explanation for like how, if you want like an anthropological relationship for the origin of religion, right? If you're just going to say it's not revelation, it's man created, then yeah, if we're looking for answers, we're going to create. It might look. Rav Soloveitchik could be right, and there could be no God in a way, right? Like man might be searching for something. We might have evolved evolutionarily with no God into a being who needs something more, but there's just nothing more there. Like that, and then maybe we create religion to answer questions, to answer practical questions, like you said, about rain and, into crops, etc., and also to fulfill another need that we've evolved to have. He hasn't even said here God created this need. He just said we have a need for God, regardless of almost whether God exists. But so if we look at this, the last source from the bottom of the first page. This is a secondary source. This is a book about Rav Soloveitchik's thought by a man named Tzvi Kolitz. He writes the Rav. If you hear modern Orthodox people in America say the Rav, they're talking about Rav Joseph Soloveitchik. He's commonly referred to that way in a lot of circles. So the Rav speaks a great deal about self-deception, which
Not your circle?
That's my nickname.
That's his name.
the Rav.
Last name is Rabbi.
Okay. So the Rav speaks a great deal about self-deception, which man resorts to unconsciously, so as to function in a life order which makes it increasingly difficult for him to know his own needs. We don't have to we actually don't even have to read the rest. This goes to the point that I was saying before of Rav. What he's claiming is everyone is in this position. We may deceive ourselves into thinking that's not the position we're in. This is the human condition universally. So he doesn't have an approach to. You might have an approach to sort of human spirituality or development that's more cultural or evolutionary, where our needs and our identities and everything almost down to our core might vary from society to society and culture to culture and have evolved differently. He's saying, at least, there is a fundamental human condition of a search for God that is universal, that if you don't, you either have not discovered it or are denying that you have it, but it's there. We can accept or deny it, but that's the starting point. If we go to source 2, we go to sort of section 2, the next thing is like, okay, what do we do with this? Like, what happens, right? So, what does God do? Like, what does God do with this? So, if we go to source 2a, here's how he describes sort of how God actually responds to man's search. So he writes, as described above, man's search for God expresses itself in intellectual activity. All sapient men search for God, right? Everyone's looking. But when the seekers reach the ultimate boundary of reality, they become alarmed and retreat. We have an inability to get beyond a certain point, right? To get beyond a certain reality that we experience. When they confront eternity with its terrifying spaces that both attract and repel, encourage and mock, they all cease their journey. Many of them are confused, many are frightened and uproot their faith. Only a few remain steadfast in the face of mystery and expect salvation from the God they seek. This is the crisis point. So everyone's on this search. Most of us probably cut it off at a certain point, just don't take it that far. We might think about it a little bit and then go skiing or something, right? Most of us take it to a certain point and stop. If you take that search to its end, and you can take that through being through all sorts of realms, right? This is a natural search. There's no revealed religion yet. You can take that through literary expression, whatever. If you're taking that search to its end, you reach the border of having no answers, some sort of end, what he's describing, right? You reach sort of the end of the universe, so to speak, and you realize you have no answers. You realize there's a lostness there. He says most people then become alarmed and retreat. This becomes like a space of fear or heresy where you sort of run away, but there's a point of crisis. He says a few people are able to wait there. And if you wait there, what he says happens, only a few remain steadfast and expect salvation from the God they seek. This is the crisis point, and here God reveals himself from above nature, from beyond the world bounded by time and space. So there is a response to this search. That is very hard to get to, but there's a response. This revelation is not a reply to man's questions, doubts, visions, and longing, right? The response doesn't, a good Jewish response, doesn't answer the question, right? Man's searching for something. God can respond, but he doesn't respond to what we're looking for. The sight of God is not a response to human yearning. God arrives suddenly. When man seeks God, he's seeking an intellect beyond him. Okay, he has specific. He's seeking an intellect that is beyond him. He wants this intellect to take note of him, enlighten him about the universe, about the essence and fate of man. Right, so man's looking for answers. Let's say that's one of the examples, looking for God. You're looking for the ultimate answers. You're waiting. God reveals himself. You think he's going to give you answers. Instead of finding the hidden intellect, he encounters the inscrutable will. This will reveals itself to man, and instead of telling him the secrets of creation, it demands unlimited discipline and absolute submission. This infinite, all-powerful will places man in a state of subjugation from which there is no release. It compels the finite to surrender to it and obey it forever. The hidden intellect encourages the creature and comforts him in his affliction, so the hidden God that sort of wants us to understand or whatever encourages us in this journey. But when we meet God, the inscrutable will conquers and subdues him. It doesn't brook any opposition. Man appears as absolutely subordinate, receiving the commandments, bending under the weight of his burden. So first of all, what's he talking about? If we step back to the concrete for a second, our religion, our tradition, in the traditional way, is a religion of law in many ways, right? That was the critique that Paul had of us. We're a religion of law. We go out there seeking God, and God says, tie fringes to four-cornered garments and do all sorts, and don't mix wool and linen and do all sorts of other things. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, to start, is acknowledging this, right? He's saying, we have this longing, and our religion answers us in law. That does not seem to be a response to the longing. And there's a disconnect here, right? So that's how he's framing our religion. Now, he's also saying, maybe, and this I really don't know, when he's saying this response, I don't know if he's saying this response is available to every human, that anyone who actually takes this journey far enough will almost experience the revelation of divine law. I don't know what that would mean. My inclination is to think that what he means, and we have some quotes from, he has a book called Halachic Man, which is a book where I think it's meant to be a portrait of his grandfather, sort of an intellectual portrait of his grandfather, where he describes the ideal halachic man, right? Halacha is Jewish law, as the sort of person who walks through the world and sees everything through the lens of Jewish law. So he has a very famous line where he talks about sunrise, and he says halachic, and he compares halachic man to what he calls homo religiosus, religious man, whose religious man is sort of yearning for spiritual, mystical experiences. So he compares, the mystical, or the homo religiosus sees the sunrise and sees God and the sunrise and all these beautiful things, and halachic man sees the sun rising and he's measuring the lights that he knows when you're supposed to say which prayer at which time. And that's where he finds God, in these concrete, mundane applications of details of Jewish law.
He's so Litvish.
He is the epitome of so do you want to explain what Litvish is versus Chassid in a word?
The idea of Litvish is that you study in a yeshiva, and that's how you connect with Judaism, versus Chassidut, which is this concept of a more spiritual enlightenment.
Yeah, so more Chassidut embraced like.
Yeah, Lithuanian.
Did I miss the definition of halacha?
So halacha is Jewish law.
Okay.
So halachic man is just the Jewish man of the man of Jewish law.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
That was a dumb question.
No dumb questions. So he comes from this Litvish dynastic family, and the Litvish approach was always the Jews on the highest level, the Jews who were the most erudite, the most learned in areas of Jewish law. Chassidut emerged. I don't know one of the arguments of the history of the way Chassidut emerged is really was a populist movement that said Judaism has become elitist. Because you have to be able to afford. Only like a few people can go study in the academy. Most people are peasants, and many aren't literate. So it's if you learn, you're close to God. But most of us who can't learn are very far from God. So it said God, you can meet God everywhere. You can meet God in the field. You meet God through song, through prayer. You don't more of a focus on prayer over learning, etc. That was its origin. Modern day Chassidut, in many ways, is indistinguishable in terms of the focus on Talmud study, etc. There's still differences, but. So he comes from that Litvish world, and he's painting the spiritual perspective of this is your relationship to God is through these details of minutia of law. But so that's the book Halachic Man. He describes this in a beautiful way of how the Halachic Man goes through the world, and everything he sees, like you see the bag of pretzels. You say what's it made? You say what's it made of, and so which bracha, which blessing do I say before eating it? Like everything you see, you're analyzing through the realm of law, of divine law. And you find God there. But here in this first source, at least 2a, he said we actually have a disconnect. First of all, we have a search for God, but the answer is not relatable at all. The answer doesn't give any response to the God we're actually looking for, which is something more than we're not looking for someone to tell us what to do. So now, if we go to source 3, he talks about how these two merge, how we sort of bridge that gap. The total compulsion that enwraps man. So he's referring to what we talked about above, the compulsion. So you meet God, and let's say for the individual, maybe you meet God through, I don't know how this journey happens for the individual who doesn't stand at Sinai and see God reveal the law. Maybe it's through you, maybe you're searching for God in a very human way. You're a Jew, you find the Jewish tradition, you start learning about it, and what you start learning about is like, do this, do this, do that. And you say like this, like, I'm on this spiritual journey, and what I'm encountering is like a bunch of like this divine will, like this doesn't work. So this compulsion that enwraps man ultimately reveals itself to be a savior, a redeemer who's come to provide him with his personal uniqueness and independence. He is bound to the authority of the Most High, but he's happy with his lot, since his subordination to the divinity frees him from the chains of the natural world and raises him to the level of freedom of the man of God. The revelational law is transformed into an existential law, which is received by the mind and blends with it in its bold free flight. Basically, the law becomes your own will. The law becomes everything you want. It's almost like this is the exact expression of everything I've wanted. That is what you end up with when you become a halachic man. Now, I'm going to give let's keep reading and then we'll give the example. The revelational law is transformed into we read that. The individual who began with a search for a reality pregnant with freedom, right? The free man, you started looking for God in this sort of open free world with no boundaries. Eventually, the blurring of the gap, so that's how we started. The blurring of the gaps that separates the free personal moral law from the compulsory revelational command causes an experience of total freedom, as if the divine commandment were identical with the demands of the creative rational consciousness. What you end up with is this sort of free bliss where the law becomes the perfect expression of everything you were looking for. Now, obviously, this is like almost like it's like a messianic vision, but on the individual level, right? Like he's painting like this is the end post of the Jewish life. The Jewish life is the end post of your spiritual journey. Ultimately, your spiritual search ultimately becomes you encounter the law. There's a conflict there, and eventually it actually becomes the mechanism that is the most obvious to you way of expressing that independent journey. Now, he's taking this structure a little bit from somewhere else, from Kant, who we talked about before, but in a different context. So here, actually, the source that I used, I wanted to get the summary, so I just asked ChatGPT to summarize a specific concept in a few sentences from Kant, and it did a better job than I'll do, I think. So we'll read the ChatGPT summary, and then we'll explain it. So Kant distinguishes between autonomy and heteronomy in moral philosophy. Right? Autonomy means I give the law to myself. I'm free. I choose the rules, like in Tom's country. Heteronomy is when someone else rules you. Someone else gives you the law. So he uses this to explain the nature of moral law and duty. Autonomy refers to self-governance, where a rational being follows moral laws they legislate for themselves through reason. So actually, let's step back from ChatGPT. Maybe I can do better. when you're walking around for Kant, when you're walking around through the world doing whatever you want, so Kant sort of asks, are you free or not free? So the standard answer is, I'm free, I can do whatever I want, right? Kant has a concept of what it means to be human, just like Rabbi Soloveitchik does. Kant's concept of being human is to be rational. If you walk around living impulsively, doing the next thing that sort of comes to your mind, he says you're living heteronomously. Why? Because you're actually not in control. You're not actually giving yourself a law of how to live. It's everything you encounter is imposing its will on you. So you're actually the least free. When you are free is when you're actually giving yourself a law. You're actually dictating the principles in which you live. For Kant, then those principles you're dictating have to be consistent with who you are for you to be free. By definition, humans are rational for him. The moral law is the rational. Humans are rational. This isn't called, yeah. I don't want to debate him. Humans may be irrational.
Did you say, by definition, humans are rational?
Are rational for Kant. For Kant, what it means to be human, not empirically all humans act rationally. What it means to be human is to be rational. How we distinguish those and put to the side, but that's like the highest level of humanity. We've sort of failed when we're not rational. The moral law that he sets out is rational. We take all these for granted. And so when you are living in accordance with the moral law, you're living with autonomy and freedom because you're living in accordance with your reason and you're dictating principles to yourself. If you're living hedonistically or a way that's being determined by all sorts of other factors, these are external factors because the internal thing is your mind. Everything else is external. So if these external things are what's impacting what you do, you're not living freely. You're living freely when your mind is telling you what to do. We can disagree with Kant's anthropology and his understanding of the human, but this is, if we come back to Rabbi Soloveitchik, there's this concept of what it means. What it means to be free isn't to walk around doing whatever you want. What it means to be free in this structure is to understand at your core what it means to be human, or what it means to be human generally, or you specifically, and then to give yourself a law or principle or dictates of how you live life based on that. When you're doing that, you're living freely because you're ultimately internally dictating what you do. If you're living any other way than that, there's external factors that are kind of prodding and pushing you, and they might be invisible factors because they're coming in from your senses, but it's not really you. Yeah.
I get the idea that both of them say you have to be driven by something in order to be free and to connect, but I'm missing what Rabbi Soloveitchik said makes logical sense, that you keep these laws and that eventually leads you to the answer of what you were seeking, but I'm missing how that happens.
Okay, so we haven't gotten yet. That's the right question. That's going to be the next piece. Is how does that work, right? So what Rav Soloveitchik said is, we're seeking out God. God, when we finally encounter Him, we get this will that doesn't really mesh with what we're seeking, and that's heteronomous, right? That's, if we're going to Kant's terminology, that's a law imposed from without. But it's not the ultimate. Soloveitchik and Kant both want this freedom, where it's self-legislated. So somehow.
And by self-legislated, you just mean a choice for it to be self-legislated, not that the rules themselves were internally originated.
Doesn't matter where they came from. It's not
just that you're doing it knowingly.
You're doing it knowingly, but it's more than that. They both believe humans have an essence, and this is probably different. I think a lot of the times, a lot of the common wisdom now might be that there is no essence. You kind of create yourself to be whatever you are, right? You can be lots of different things. You can live lots of different lives. And in that case, there's not one autonomy, so to speak, because I can choose to be this kind of person, this kind of life, that kind of person, that kind of life.
Are you using self-legislative as a synonym for autonomous?
Yes.
That's
Yes.
what I thought. Okay.
For Kant and for Soloveitchik, humans have essences. You can't just be whatever. You can just do whatever you want, but there's the self-deception piece. Because at your core, you are something. From Soloveitchik, it's you are searching for God. Let's say for Kant, it's you are a rational being. At your core, you are something. So if you say, I actively choose, I've thought about it, I've considered it, I've looked at all the options, I've spent 10 years meditating on it, and I'm going to be a hedonist. You're not free from his perspective because you just got it wrong. That's not who you are. Now, we could critique that, but again, the goal here is to sort of portray Rav Soloveitchik's philosophy. You may not accept all sorts of pieces of it, and that's okay. But there's an essentialism here, which is there is something that you are, period. There's something what it means to be human. And so if you are not living in accordance with the rules that someone who knows what it means to be human would lay out, then you're not living freely because you're ultimately being influenced by something else.
Humans will have different.
So how Rav Soloveitchik, how this
That's-
works with
that's-
non-Jews is a problem. I don't know, because if ultimately the halacha, the Jewish law, is the expression of what it means of the highest expression of the human search for God, yeah, then you have to say, then it's hard to see how that would work with a religious pluralism.
Start essentializing different people differently.
You would ultimately, yeah, or either that, or maybe you could say there's 5 different options, or there's a whole bunch of options. But I'm not sure what he would say. This makes it harder. This definitely puts Judaism as the highest expression of religion, whereas there could be other versions of seeing. Eliezer Berkowitz's philosophy might allow for more religious pluralism. I don't know how he would. I don't know how he would answer that. He might have answered it somewhere in his writings. I don't have the answer. Yeah.
So he's essentially saying if you don't accept rabbinic Judaism and halacha, you're not finding God. Am I
Not at the
right?
highest level. Yeah, he's not holding. He believes in call it Orthodox or Halachic Judaism as the ultimate expression. It sounds like of humanity, to be frank, right? Again, we're going to cover different thinkers over the course of this time. That's his
So this could
position.
be where
They're pretty awesome.
But Kant was universal, and I mean they paralleled each other, but Kant was universal. It wasn't a Jewish thing.
No, not yes. They parallel, and Rav Soloveitchik uses a lot of the structures that he's clearly taken from Kant, and we know he wrote his PhD on one of Kant's most important students. Like, he obviously studied Kant, and so he's definitely borrowing concepts, and he's applying them into Jewish philosophy. Yeah.
And
I'm just going to say something which
Yeah.
may not be okay.
No.
But so that means modern orthodoxy is here and reform is here, and that's where a lot of people look down if you're not a certain level of Judaism.
So I think, I want to speak first, not necessarily directly to him. I think proponents of all sorts of different types of Abraham Geiger would say Reform Judaism is the right form. I think that's good to me personally. I think it's good to have people arguing, saying this is the best, and arguing for different positions and debating with each other. Doesn't mean you have to look down on someone else, but we should be looking for the way of living that we think is best. It would be silly to not. Right? Like, why would we not look for that? And so I think this is maybe this is me personally. You can accept people. You can be okay with this or not. But I think we should absolutely be being tolerant of people from different positions to a degree, as long as they're not inflicting certain types of harm. But we also should be advocating over the course. I'm hoping we're going to cover thinkers from various different movements. We're not only going to cover Orthodox thinkers, but I think it's good to have thinkers who are arguing this is the best way and here's why. And then we can disagree with them or not and have that debate. But to me, that's a lot more interesting and compelling than someone says, here's a cool way. That's all. Let's get the best arguments for everything. I'm not saying he's the best argument for modern Orthodoxy. I actually I think Berkowitz is a better argument to me personally in a lot of ways. But yeah, he's saying this is the best. I don't think he was saying that he definitely he definitely was a major opponent of Orthodox Judaism and was very protective, and he was concerned about conservative and Reform Judaism. He saw them as a threat.
But he's not,
That's the case.
He's not, I mean, I've read a little bit of him, not as much as you. So far in what you covered today, he's not arguing for specifically modern Orthodox Judaism. He's arguing for a halachic process-oriented Judaism.
Yeah, so if you could
end up at a different halachic process-oriented Judaism, and you'd still be
Yes.
in one of those valid, acceptable.
Yes, you could work on a lot. So I think, for example, the conservative movement has, even officially from as an institution, has a formal halachic process. He may have disagreed with that halachic process, but that structure fits in this philosophy. Mm-hmm. If there's no legal process, that would fit less in his philosophy, because this is a philosophy of Judaism, this law. So my understanding, and I'm not at all an expert, is that Reform has less of a legal process. So that would work less with this approach. Right. That would work less.
It has a legal
Yes.
process. You mentioned it earlier. It's not you're not bound to that legal process.
Right. Okay. Right. So I'll plead ignorance
To her
on
point,
that.
we're kind of in a better scenario than other religions because we have more or less 3 sects: Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and Christianity has lots of sects. I have a friend who was some kind of a Christian She
You're really close.
She had to convert the Greek Orthodox to marry her husband, who was Greek Orthodox from another Christian sect, and it's like, okay. Anyway.
Right. Fair. Fair
Could
enough.
you very briefly, it came up, we
Yeah.
were discussing it during dinner tonight, I don't wanna get off task.
Yeah.
What's the difference between modern Orthodox and Orthodox?
Okay. So, I think every like framework you give, as you start to look closer under a microscope, has more and more shades of gray. So I'll put that as a caveat, right? I think in its origin, as a very simple way, modern Orthodox Judaism not only saw engagement in the secular world as like necessary to make a living, of like go open your shop or get a job, but actually saw that there was positive value in the secular world on an independent level, not just like, oh, I need to engage in it to make money. So there's a value, right? He got a PhD in philosophy. It's saying, I value the world of secular learning for what it is. It has something to offer me and not just like a way to survive. I think whereas ultra-Orthodox Judaism, if I had to like do this categorization, I'd put Orthodox on the top of the tree and then say like modern and ultra-Orthodox as two different versions of it. Ultra-Orthodox Judaism would see less of a value in the secular world. It would say like, I might need to engage with it because I need to get on the bus, I need to get on a plane, I need to make a living. But any free time, if I'm going to spend my free time on something of value, it should be Jewish. Whereas a modern Orthodox, someone like Rabbi Soloveitchik took his free time and said, I'm going to go to the University of Berlin. I think that probably as a starting point is like is a core like intellectual difference.
I was just thinking about how, Karen, when you sort of were developing a hierarchy, to me, I feel like that sort of comes when the philosophy gets watered down and people don't really, it's not necessarily a learned thing, it's that we sort of whisper down the lane and it's not a part of study, it's a part of almost like I don't want to use the word gossip, but that's what's coming to me. Just like you're not really necessarily evaluating things on the philosophical principles or the religious principles, but people sort of take a position without necessarily studying that position.
Right.
And I feel like that's a lot of that in the
No
world
data backup.
now. Yeah.
Right. And I think, and
that's what it today.
And I think, and then after this, I want to sort of keep moving on. But I think to that point, I think that's where the difference between arguing, saying, here's the position I believe, versus looking down on and saying like, and treatment, tolerance, looking down on someone as like worse. I think that kind of basically social cliquiness, like kind of like, oh, this is like our social group is like, that's basically what it is, right? Communities building walls, which they do to protect themselves, and therefore looking down on people outside of those walls. But yeah, I do think there are, so I think a lot of that, especially like looking down on, comes from places of ignorance and just mistreatment and like arrogance or whatever. I think there are philosophers who will argue for certain types, saying this is like, here's why I think this is the best position. You know, like if you believe in a certain political position, let's say you're a capitalist, right? And you believe that capitalism is best in whatever form. It's not doing an evil to a friend of yours who's a socialist to say like, no, I believe in the system. You can be tolerant, have engaging conversations, respect the person, and think they're wrong, right? Say, I actually think this is the best way. But those conversations should happen on a open, and they shouldn't be done treating someone differently. And I actually think if we had the ability to have those conversations and both be honest, one, like not be offensive or offended, right? Like sort of, which puts the responsibility on both sides. I think that yields a lot more fruitful conversation, because you don't have to hum and haw. You can say, hey, here's an argument. Here's why I think the poor would be better off with lower taxes. And here's why. And someone said, you're crazy. It's all going to end up, all the money's going to end up, here's why we need to increase taxes for these kinds of programming to level a playing field. And have that debate. And that debate should happen. And it's okay for both those positions to believe in their positions. The way that American political discourse happens is probably not the way we want discourse to happen between Jewish movements. That's bad.
Was the
Yeah.
word I couldn't really think about. Demonizing.
Anyways, I want to move. What time is it? Okay, let's move forward. So, Jeff, you asked, how do we bridge that gap, right? Man searching for God, God comes down with the law, doesn't seem to speak to the law. Somehow, eventually, that becomes the great expression of freedom. Like, how does that actually work? So, for this, we're going to look at two sources from a book, or only one, I guess, from a book called Halachic Mind, also by Rabbi Soloveitchik. He writes, the objective religious order is identical with the psychophysical religious act in which the living historical religious consciousness comes to expression. Just as the most concrete expression of art is to be found in books, paintings, etc., so are the most reliable sources of religious objective constructs to be found in religious literature containing norms, dogmas, postulates, etc. The canonized scriptures serve as the most reliable standard of reference for objectivity. Through the method of reconstruction, God's word, the letter of scriptures, becomes an inner word, a certainty, insight, confession of the God-thirsty soul. He almost goes to he definitely believed in revelation, but this almost sounds like an anthropological argument for religion. What he basically says is, if you want to find the greatest expression of this natural free human yearning for God, go to the great religious texts and the great religious canons. He doesn't here necessarily even only Judaism. Go to the great religious practices. Those are the greatest manifestations we have of the internal human search for God. And then if you go and live in those, it can actually pull you back into those subjective experiences. So putting aside the question of revelation and how it works and whether this part came from God or from man, let's say God gave us these rules that are the most apt external expression of this yearning. It just isn't intuitive at the beginning, right? If you want to understand the soul of the artist, look at the great works of art, is the equivalent of what he's saying. If you want to understand the deepest expression of human religious longing, look at the greatest works of religion. The external ones, the ones that are written in books, the great rituals, the great practices, right? Maybe not only the Jewish ones. Look at the Hajj, look at whatever, right? But and then if you go and become a part of those, you'll find your way back you can work your way backwards back into that subjective experience, right? So that's the answer as to why following the religious law. And by the way, this maybe opens us up to a bit more religious pluralism, because maybe there's other great expressions of the human religious search that can pull you back. But it has to happen. We can't all just get there on our own, because most of us, like in any realm, most of us are not the best at the world and definitely not the best in world history at anything, right? So if you want to get to the greatest ways to express religiosity, find the best in world history. Take what they've given you, use those use those in the physical world, like not just like thinking, and don't just try to come up with your own little practice in the morning, because those are actually those are the greatest tools we have to tap back into that experience. That's the argument as to why the lived, organized religious life actually can pull us back into the greatest subjective experience and how these two parts come together. And he says, so if we go down to the second paragraph here, he says, to illustrate, we may analyze the triad in the God-man relation. First, the subjective private finitude infinity tension. Second, objective normative outlook. Third, the full concrete realization. We'll explain this in a second. A subjective God-man relation implies various contradictory states: wrath and love, remoteness and immanence, repulsion and fascination, etc. This subjective attitude in turn is reflected in the form of logical cognitive judgments or an ethical religious norm. Because God exists, he's omniscient, he's omnipresent. What he's saying here, he's starting to give examples of what we just described, and he's doing it in a way this is known as this is the most difficult work of his to read probably, but he's describing, we have religious norms or religious dogmas. Even say God exists, God does that. We have norms of fear God, love God, etc. Saying what are all these and we haven't even gotten to the act of commandments like prayer, put on tefillin, phylacteries, etc. Saying these are expressions of subjective experiences, right? When we say God exists, we're expressing a human experience. What exactly that is, I don't have the words for this, longing, whatever. When we say fear God, or we say you ought to pray, we're starting to express something that's going on in this internal experience. So pulling back what he's saying again, and this goes to that same point, the reason that he says the law and this external act can ultimately, while initially experienced as sort of coercion or heteronomous, right, as being legislated from the outside, can ultimately be this expression of freedom, is because it pulls us. It's actually an expression. It's an external expression of the internal religious experience, the internal natural search for God, and we can tap back into that sort of natural human search through these external expressions. Very silly, easy example, right? Talk about a relationship of I don't do this, but let's say you buy your partner flowers every Friday for Shabbat, right? It's not arguably that's something it's not that can be an act that you do that's like initially if like your partner says like buy me flowers every Friday, right? It's like initially you might just like do it, you just like whatever. It's like you do it, it's annoying, okay,
It's
fine.
illegal to spend money on shit.
Before, yeah. Right? And then the idea is this is an act that can be an expression of the emotional state. And maybe not, but maybe can be a way to also tap back into that expression. Again, that's like a very mundane example, but that's the idea is the external act is both ideally originally sourced from that state, but also can pull you back into that, right?
He's implying that it's static.
Through history, there is a degree. So how much halacha changes or not put to the side, he believes, and this goes back to that point of
Some
human nature.
essential element of it
There is
that
a
is
universal
important.
human nature, almost ahistorically and across cultures. It's not like every culture. There's a fundamental human experience, and that's a different belief about what humans are like. So there's a famous debate, and then we'll read one last source and wrap up. There's a famous debate, and I'm going to get some of this wrong, so forgive me, but between, I believe, like the position of Rabbi Soloveitchik, another rabbi was named Emanuel Rachman, about I can't remember the mechanism, but one of the mechanisms for affecting divorce. If you remember, let me know. And Mazel Tov. There's a question, and I'm forgetting the actual material, but there was a question. I believe it was a case where a marriage was conducted under false pretenses. If a marriage is conducted under false pretenses, meaning there's misleading, and one of the two thinks something about the other partner that isn't true, and whether it has to be intentional or how big, but there's there's a misleadingness to a degree or an error. It's a transaction in error, and the marriage wasn't effective. The transaction had never took effect.
How many years do you have to call that in?
I think you're probably
I'll be
not.
I'm not sure what the statute of limitations is on
I
it.
must commend you though on your multitasking with the Mazel Tov.
Thank you. In one of these cases that comes up in the Talmud, the woman was had a false assumption, she was misled, let's say, and she discovers, and the question is the marriage void? The underlying question as to whether the marriage is void or not is based on would she have agreed otherwise? And there's a concept, and this is not very acceptable in a modern society, but the concept that comes up in the Talmud is a woman would rather, at the end of the day, basically, a woman would rather be with someone than be alone. Again, let's talk about a context where women couldn't really earn income. A woman who was married and no longer a virgin and then left out might be in a very bad political, might be a very bad economic, social situation. Like, in certain societies, that may have been very true, right? And maybe it's not true now. Maybe it depends. Put that to the
That's
side.
very true of men now.
Right, yeah. Right. Right. So the question is, to the degree that whatever this mistake was, you still would have agreed to the marriage or not. Anyways, so there was a debate. I don't remember what the issue was that came up, but Rabbi Rachman basically said that was contextual. That was true in a certain time. And so there was a marriage, a couple comes, says, are we really married or not? The woman wants to say, I'm not married. Rav Soloveitchik, I believe the position he took, and again, I might be getting this wrong, but I believe this is even if it's wrong, if it's a myth, it's a good example. And I know we're recording this, but was the concepts in the Talmud, the halachic concepts, are reflective of universal human nature, of what's something fundamental about what it means to be woman, man. And again, maybe we reinterpret what it means exactly, but we can reinterpret it about rather being alone than not in ways that are positive or negative, depending how we read it. But that was a debate about is our halachic concepts reflective of a universal human nature or contextual? I think Rav Soloveitchik might take other pieces and say it was still contextual. So it's not like he says everything never changes and Rabbi Rachman said everything's always changing, but Rabbi Soloveitchik leaned towards a halachic conservatism in a lot of ways, and there is this philosophy of there's this underlying fundamental human nature that is expressed in Jewish law. And if we start to play around with it too much, we actually lose the ability to tap back in, right? If this is a map, called almost like a map or a guide to get back to that fundamental human experience of that quest for God, if we screw with the map too much, then it's not going to take us there anymore, right? So there's definitely a concern, even if he'd be willing to change certain pieces, there's a hesitancy here around. We don't want to just run and change everything, because this is actually a map to this fundamental human experience that is the goal. That's the goal of Jewish living for him.
The law can't be fluid and still work.
It can't. Yeah, you can't just change. You can't keep changing the map and think you're going to get to the place, right? You might change the map when there's an earthquake because the thing, these analogy is getting out of it's not working. So you might need to change the map when like something changes in the city, but you can't just keep changing whatever you want.
But the irony is that he is the beneficiary in order to read Kant and do this of a tremendous amount of change in Judaism to get to where he is. So he's implying that there's all this change that happened. I'm going to pretend it didn't happen and then stop change moving forward.
So I don't think he's saying pretend. So I think, and this goes back to maybe the question of modern orthodoxy. I think in its origins, definitely with people like Rav Soloveitchik, there was intellectually a great openness to the world and what we can continue to learn, because there is an ability for man as he continues to quest to God to create great creations like Kantian philosophy.
We're going to change what we do.
But our fundamental but the revealed law that is this map back to that human experience, we have to be very careful. There might be parts of it, there are definitely parts of it that are human made. Most of our laws are rabbinic, right? Or a huge portion of it. The Talmud's written by men. Actually men, not just man as a thing for men and women, right? So there might be pieces that can change, but if it's this guide, if it's this divine guide that's core to that human nature, we have to be very conservative, and it's changing. So modern orthodoxy was intellectually open to what humans could create and the real value in what all humans could create, but deeply conservative in its approach to halakha, because the halakha is this divine guide. And so that's balancing. So that's the balance of that openness to modernity and change, but a halachic
in the
conservative
theoretical, but still, if you go to a modern Orthodox school versus more of a yeshiva school, the things that they choose to emphasize and the halakha that they choose to emphasize, while acknowledging that all of it is real and legitimate, the difference in emphasis creates fundamental change.
Yes, so that's a cultural and sociological answer to your question about sort of modern orthodoxy and ultra-orthodoxy. I'm giving like this sort of theoretical approach. Yeah.
You use yeshiva school to be like a traditional Orthodox school.
Like a centrist Orthodox school.
Okay.
I want to finish with one or two things. I know we're over time. So one, this last source, you can read it on your own if you want, but the other point that he makes that's interesting about halakha, or religion of Jewish law, is the democratizing aspect, which is, if we talked about like the sort of these spiritual quests in all sorts of different realms, these are going to be achieved in any realm, whether it's through through science, literature, art, religion, by unique they're going to be people at the pinnacle, at the top. What halakha does to a degree is democratizes, right? When there's a law, like if there's a law of say this prayer by this time, these days of the year, you either do it or you don't. Like everyone's kind of in the same game, and there's a democratizing aspect to Jewish law. So he writes about that in a beautiful way. He talks about, from the wood chopper of water. If we go to the bottom of that source, it's worth reading the whole thing. But he says, from the hewer of the wood to the drawer of the water, how can the wood chopper and the water jar participate in this adventurous meeting of God and man, if not through helping in a humble way to realize the covenantal norm? Right? There are people who don't have the luxury and the time to sit and think about their quest for God. By having the ability to access it through these sort of objective norms that everyone can just do or not do, it has actually a deep democratizing effect as well. That's the end sort of the class of Soloveitchik. I'll just give a reminder of what we talked about last week, just to compare like Berkovitz versus Soloveitchik. Here what you have is really the portrayal of religion as the search for the ultimate, the sort of the goal, let's say, is really the perfecting of the personality of the human, right? It's not, and that if every human becomes perfect, society will be great, right? And a perfect human might have a great effect on society, but it isn't social focused, right? Its focused isn't political organization. Like, there's nothing political about this. I mean, everything's political nowadays, but like, there's nothing inherently political. There's nothing inherently economic. Like, this is about the perfecting of the religious personality. For Eliezer Berkovitz, the whole structure and the whole goal of religion was trying to build a society that could be a model society, and that meant we had to if halakha concepts had been focused on certain things and not focused on modern economies, like we had to switch gears and start, once we had a state, and focus on economy and military and other things, so we could talk about how you embody the Jewish goal of building a model society by dealing with all those issues. So that for Berkovitz, the focus nowadays should be on all these bigger issues, whereas for Soloveitchik, we can go way back to details of halakha and how they affect private life, right? So these are probably the two most influential modern Orthodox thinkers in North America of the 20th century. The ways they lived their lives may have in many ways been very similar. Their religious practices may have been very, very similar, but their perspective on what this is doing, what you're supposed to be focused on, I would say are almost diametrically opposed as you can get, being within really the same movement. And that's part of the goal of these sort of series is to sort of give a variety of perspectives on what these thinkers actually say what this whole thing is about, what this Jewish tradition is about. So I'm going to wrap it up there because I know I'm over.